Hello and welcome to the Inner Sense channel. Today we're joined by Professor Karl Friston, a theoretical neuroscientist whose work has reshaped how many people think about brains, minds and living systems. Karl is Professor of Neuroscience based in London, who has pioneered many of the common tools used in brain imaging which have become international standards. Today we'll talk about active inference, a framework that aims to describe how living systems and other systems stay alive or perpetuate themselves by predicting, acting and updating their beliefs. Karl is one of the most widely cited neuroscientists in the world, and it's a pleasure to have him on the Inner Sense channel. I could list many accolades, but I'd like to allow Karl to explain his background. But before I do that, please can you subscribe to the Inner Sense channel if you'd like more information on body awareness, interoception, and tips and well-being to help improve the way you feel. Good evening, Karl.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. And can we please just hear a little bit to begin with about your background in psychiatry and exposure to patients and how that may have shaped how you began to think about modeling living systems and how brains function?
Yes, of course. So I trained as a medic, but had an eye on a career which was, in those days, probably best described as mathematical psychology, a formal account of the way that we make sense of the world. So I trained as a medic, but also did physics at Cambridge University as a prelude to later career move from after obtaining membership of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, moved into research, specifically brain imaging, human brain mapping, and devoted much time to elaborating the tools that were required to make sense of brain imaging data. And then happily was able to adopt or repurpose those tools to understand how we make sense of our sense data, our vision, and clearly from the point of view of this conversation, the signals and the sense making of our bodily, the messages from our body, which is probably one of the most important sense organs. And subsequent to that, became effectively a theoretical neuroscientist, trying to, through the lens of physics and self-organization and statistics, understand how the brain works, not just in terms of making sense of the world, but also making decisions under uncertainty, how one can understand the principles that underwrite our choices and indeed our subpersonal behaviors, such as motor activity and autonomic reflexes.
So yeah, you started with medicine and people and sort of moved into this real detailed way of trying to understand exactly how people work and brains work. And were there any moments when you were learning about health and disease or seeing specific patients or clinical moments that made you think that the models were missing something? I guess I'm asking what inspired you to develop the frameworks in the way that you did?
Well, my particular exposure and focus during medical training was in psychiatry, and within that spent about 2 years in a psychiatric community populated by people with chronic schizophrenia. So I developed a special interest at many levels in schizophrenia as a particular condition. And my initial research in brain imaging was indeed to try and characterize or phenotype, using brain imaging technology, the disorders of functional specialization integration in the brain that led people to suffer from the the symptoms and signs of schizophrenia. And you could argue that with reference to your question, what was missing, there's lots of things that are missing in our understanding of the way that um, our conspecifics suffer, but specifically from the point of view of psychiatric nosology, a lack of a mechanistic understanding. So much of the theoretical work, and indeed actually much of the inspiration for the statistical tools that are used to analyze brain imaging data, was in order to understand mechanistically some of the failures of distributed processing and sense making in people with psychiatric disorders, and in particular schizophrenia. And finally, the theoretical neurobiology, as exemplified by the free energy principle and active inference, it's all about trying to get a physics of beliefs, a physics of sentience, a physics of belief updating, so that now you can model in a computer and simulate and perform in silico experiments on things that actually have beliefs. So it's connecting the neurobiology, the neurophysiology, the neuroanatomy of our brains to the belief updating that is, I think, a necessary aspect of understanding certainly a patient, but also certainly understanding the mechanisms that underlie the experiences of a patient, or if their behaviors and their choices.
Mm-hmm. So there's lots of directions we could go in now, but I'd like to pick up on that term, the physics of belief, which stands out to me as when I'm lecturing in biomedical science, which is what I spend the majority of my time at Anglia Ruskin doing. We often explain the basics of physics to students and explain that, I don't know, metabolic reactions follow the laws of thermodynamics, and enzymes sort of reduce the activation energy of a reaction and so on. So it appears to the students like we understand biology very well. But then when we get to something like the concept of a belief and a prediction and a system or an organism using a belief in order to guide its next action, how do you make the jump from something like a enzyme and a metabolic pathway to a system that's predicting? I mean, we've got a thermostat maybe in this room it could be anticipating a weather change and then adjusting in advance of the weather, but that's been designed by an engineer. Where do you see that sort of fuzzy gap being filled through your work?
Well, it's probably much simpler than you might imagine, but to do that, I'm going to have to sort of invert the question about how do you get a physics of beliefs, and say and restate the problem as, can you ascribe to the basic behavior of physical systems an explanation or a description in terms of belief updating? And that's probably much simpler than you might imagine. That's effectively the free energy principle. And what that says is that anything that manages to self-organize in a way that preserves its integrity, in the sense that preserves its ability to separate itself from the environment, it doesn't dissipate, it doesn't decay, it doesn't diffuse into the environment, can always be read as performing technically what is known as Bayesian belief updating, but more colloquially, it can always be read as if it is doing some kind of predictive processing. So you'll never actually know, of course, because to actually get inside the head of a thermostat, or inside my head, you'd have to break me or the thermostat. But certainly, looking at the behaviour of anything that shows this kind of self-organization, technically, to an attracting set or a pullback attractor, just that maintains some characteristic states over extended periods of time, licenses just the very existence of these things, licenses a description of them in terms of inference, prediction, predictive processing, and belief updating. It's interesting you introduced thermodynamics and metabolic rate constants and the like, and at some point I imagine that you might have implicitly or explicitly referred to a principle of least action, the path of minimum effort, the path of maximum efficiency. The fact that things tend to travel in straight lines. They find the path of least resistance. So these are all vernacular expressions of a principle of least action, which underwrites most, if not all, of physics. You can apply exactly the same principle of least action to a description of the states of, say, your brain, where you associate the states of your brain with some probability distributions, which are known as Bayesian beliefs. So that's why we can talk about a physics of beliefs, because we just associate a particular state of my brain, say its neural firing or its connectivity, with a parameterization or encoding of a probability distribution or about or over things on the outside that are causing my sensations. So every time my brain changes, so does my belief. And that can be regarded as belief updating, or updating one's belief on the basis of sensory evidence from the body or from the eyes. And that belief updating is exactly, conforms exactly to the principle of least action. So the free energy principle is just exactly the same kind of thermodynamic principle, Hamilton's principle of least action, but in the special case, it's applied to dynamics on the inside of something that are interpreted or read as encoding beliefs about things on the outside of a person, or indeed a particle, or a thermostat.
Okay, so that internal model of what's outside helps the system to behave in a way through the principle of least action, so that it can continue itself, it can survive into the future. I'd like just to talk about modeling at the moment for a moment. So you develop models in silico to help explain living systems or other systems using the active inference framework. So for people who are not familiar with modeling, I could create a little Lego model of a wheelbarrow, let's say, and have a little pile of sand and calculate how many times I need to wheel this pile of sand to the other end of the room, and how long that takes. And that might help me model how long it'll take me to move a real pile of sand in my garden, if I sort of scale it up. So is what you're doing in silico similar to that? You're modeling a living system in order to help understand or help predict how living systems work in the real world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I liked your analogy with moving earth with a wheelbarrow. It reminded me that there is actually a mathematical branch of belief updating that refers to the Earth mover's distance. So where the Earth is a probability mass, and you have to move probabilities around, very much in the spirit of belief updating, moving a probability distribution from one place to another place, as we change our minds, literally. Sorry, yes, I forgot what your question was. I was so intrigued by the.
Yes. So
that was the phenotyping. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. So you can look at this in many different ways. So in the academic literature, this is known as computational phenotyping. But basically, what it means is building a little digital twin of this person, and a very simple simplification of this person. So it's just apt for this paradigm or this choice or this game, this experimental setup in question. But if you can build a little belief updating machine in silico in a computer that is able to make the same choices and decisions when confronted with experimental cues that the real subject can, then you can engineer or tweak the beliefs, the prior beliefs of this particular of your in-silico patient, your digital twin, until the behavior of the in-silico agent matches that of a real patient, for example. And then what you've got, because you've been able to explain the behavior of your real person in terms of a calculus or a physics of belief updating that you've been able to simulate and personalize in a precision medicine kind of way to the person that you're trying to characterize, you've now phenotyped, you've understood the motivation and the mechanics of the belief updating of this person in terms of their prior commitments, their assumptions, their intentions, at both a personal and usually more importantly, a sub-personal level, in a way that you can now associate with certain substrate-dependent process theories. Remember when you were starting, you were explaining or describing how you'd explain biophysics to students in terms of enzymes and depolarization and kinetics and the like. These are all really important substrates that represent the substrate upon which this belief updating occurs. For example, in the brain, we have sort of neural activity, we have connection strengths, and that conform to these biophysical principles that you teach. And there exists a mapping now between this sort of predictive processing and belief updating in the computer and how people think it is actually instantiated in a substrate-dependent fashion in a real person's brain. And there's a pharmacology associated with that, a biology, a physiology associated with that. So not only do you have a sort of now, if you've optimized the behavior of or the prior beliefs of your digital twin of the person, not only do you have an understanding of implicitly what they are thinking at some usually a subpersonal level, but you also now have a clue as to what neurochemical, neurophysiological, and possibly neuroanatomical processes are involved in making these decisions and making those choices. And of course, if you're in psychiatry or working on, say, neurology, then you now have targets, therapeutic targets, that would be amenable to therapeutic interventions using either drugs or psychopharmacology or psychotherapy or different kinds of cognitive behavioral therapy, simply because you now have a mechanistic understanding of why this person is behaving in this way.
Lovely. And so I guess over time, as the in silico models become more sophisticated, we can match them. We can match them to a sort of personalized profile of an individual, rather than saying, a big category of people with something like schizophrenia. You could maybe personalize it to an individual and maybe their life situation or their medical history, and then choose the best intervention approach.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, you certainly can use these models to characterize or reproduce group differences between diagnostic categories, and people like Ryan Smith at the Laureate Institute in the States is an artist of doing this. So looking at people who are prone to addiction versus not prone to addiction, for example, characterizing the groups in terms of this style, the active inference style of belief updating. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the real potency of this formal approach, this mechanistic approach that spans both the substrate and the belief structure, is going to be best applied in a personalized or precision medicine context. And as you say, this is going to be very context sensitive, because people have to update their beliefs from millisecond to millisecond in terms of just visually palpating the world and just making sense of what's going on around them in conversation. But also they have to update their beliefs, their self-models, at a much slower time scale, and certainly in response to traumatic events, for example. If you lose a loved one, or you move to a new city, this requires an enormous amount of belief updating, a revision of your internal model, your predictive model, your generative model, generating the sensory consequences of the things out there that are causing your sensorium. And therefore, there are going to be periods of life, of your life, and you express this in terms of the history, that are going to be extremely important in establishing the context for the kind of belief updating and the prior beliefs that are in play at this point in the person's life, or indeed in terms of their illness trajectory or recovery.
A question just popped to my mind about this kind of maybe conflicting beliefs that people might have. So we've talked about the in-silico models now, and now if we can talk about the internal model, which active inference framework sort of proposes that we hold inside of us for our internal state and what's going on in the world around us. And you talked about belief updating and changes in beliefs and selection policy and predictions in the moment, maybe in the millisecond. I often sort of have this scenario I think about, which is, you talked about different stages in people's life where you may be faced with two different choices. So let's say I'm progressing from being a parent to a grandparent, and I think, okay, now I want to stay alive for another 10, 20 years so that I can care for my grandchildren. And I'm aware that that requires, or it will be supported by, healthy behavior and healthy lifestyle. So, I'm going to say no to certain foods, which before I may have been tempted by, in order to try and extend my life. And then that person then walks down the street and they smell, a bakery, and then, their body kind of swerves towards the bakery because it gives them a powerful kind of drive to eat something tasty, and that may override the thought that they had a few moments later about being healthy. So how does I know you have provided very good explanations of the hierarchical structure of the brain and depths of different layers of the brain holding different depths of belief, and how these can be sort of feeding up and down towards each other. How do you explain that kind of decision making over different timescales?
Right. So you would explain it, and indeed you'd instantiate the architecture required or implied by that explanation in these digital twins. So it's nice you brought this notion of an internal or generative model to the table, because we, on this view or account, we all have our internal models. The idea of the digital twin was to actually replicate a little internal model or a generative model in the computer that emulated your internal model that we use to generate or predict both what's out there that could have caused what I'm seeing at the moment, but also, interestingly, you've moved immediately to a really crucial aspect of this, which is moving from sense making to decision making, or moving from perception to action. You also have to infer what to do next, and of course, this is a particularly important kind of inference or belief updating. What am I going to do next? What do I think will happen if I do that, as opposed to doing this? And of course, you have to have that capacity to roll out into the future in your generative model, in your internal model. So now your generative model has to have the ability to prospectively roll out into the future, conditioned upon various plans, policies, and evaluate the consequences of pursuing this course of action as opposed to pursuing that course of action. So this kind of mechanics occurs deep inside your brain, and I use the word deep just as reference to what you were describing, which is this sort of layered hierarchical aspect to these generative models or internal models. And the deep implies that it has a hierarchical depth, and we could spend a long time talking about mechanics of message passing between different levels and the increasing abstraction. But let's just jump to what I think you're driving at, which is the mechanics of choice behavior, the maths of motivated behavior, and where do intentions and preferences and needs and wants get into the game. It's mathematically much simpler than you might imagine. It all boils down to understanding the principle of least action, where now the action pertains to a course of action into the future. And how do you score one course of action into the future, say going on a healthy diet as opposed to binging yourself at the nearest cake store? So these are two possible scenarios. I could walk past, or I can go into the cake store. So how do I make a choice between the two? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit to a principle of least action. The action here is literally the sum of the expected surprise, the expected free energy that I would accumulate if I pursued this course of action, carried on walking, as opposed to going into the cake store. So what's this expected surprise or expected free energy? It has two parts. It's mathematically just one thing, and it is the action that we're talking about in terms of an energy times time. But I think in terms of interpreting and understanding it, it's useful to decompose it into two parts. There is one part of it which is takes one view on expected surprise, which is uncertainty. So the goodness of one path is scored by the degree to which it resolves uncertainty or expected surprise. This is just information gain. It's what makes us information seeking, novelty seeking. It's what makes us curious creatures. But there's another way of minimizing the surprise I expect, which is to avoid very surprising, unpreferred outcomes, things that are uncharacteristic of me. So previously we were talking about what it is to be, and to be is just to remain in characteristic states for a suitable period of time, revisiting those states time and time again that define the kind of thing that I am. That means that I don't occupy or work towards uncharacteristic, very surprising states, being very, very cold, being dead, being unloved. All of these things would be uncharacteristic of the kind of thing that I am, and therefore I can avoid those things if I include this more pragmatic or instrumental kind of expected surprise or cost into my scoring of the quality of pursuing this. So there are two parts to this. There's an epistemic part, sometimes referred to as an intrinsic value, and then there's this more pragmatic instrumental part that just ensures that I do not enter into very, very surprising states. Now, the way that this is scored is in terms of the preferences that I have for characteristic states in every dimension, in every space. So it could be in terms of my blood sugar, but it also could be in terms of, am I a good grandparent? And my distribution of those preferences can be very, very precise, or it can be very, very broad. And I can contextualize that, and I can learn that. So let's just take the example of, do I go into the cake store, or do I be a good grandparent and carry on? So if I had a very, very, very precise belief that a good grandparent would not go into the cake store and eat himself to a heart attack, then I would find going into the cake store extremely implausible. It would have an extremely high expected free energy because there'd be a high expected surprise or cost to that, because that sets me up for not being a good grandparent, because I have because good grandparents do not go into cake stores to binge. However, if I have an even preciser belief that I need to keep my blood sugar within these very tiny bounds, then it is possible that if I carry on down the street and I have a generative model of my interoception, my physiology, and I work out that my blood sugar is now going to become very surprising and uncharacteristic and uncharacteristically low, then at some point the plausibility that I am the kind of thing that will walk down the street and deny myself the opportunity to eat some sugar will now render this policy less likely than going into the blood sugar. So it all depends on the precision, the conviction, the confidence that you afford certain outcomes that define the thing that you are. So in this instance, I will have certain precise beliefs that I am a human being with a certain physiology and a certain need for cakes. But on the other hand, I also have another dimension, which is to be a good person. In this instance, a good grandparent, and both of those are going to contribute to the expected surprise. There's also, of course, the expected information gain, so it might be quite fun to see what else is in the store, but also even more fun to walk down the street and see what's around the corner. So, all of these things are balanced by the precision or the confidence I actually afford my beliefs.
Yes. So I can see now how, with this kind of weighting of different incoming sensory information and beliefs associated with what that incoming information means, then to create a model, an in silico model, or even to understand oneself, one's own drives, then there may be other things that are crosstalk between different sensory channels that may be influencing things. So if, let's say, with the example of walking down the street, if the strength of the smell is stronger on one day than the other, or the air temperature is different and that's affecting a person's perception of energy use over the next hour, if it's a cold day like today, then that may alter the weighting given to that sensory information compared to another day. Or if the person has just received a call from their grandchild, for example, and that's fresh on their mind, that then the weighting of the belief, how that's going to influence the next action, may change it in comparison to the smell of or the sight of the cake shop. So what's the can you give as a sort of snapshot of where these most sophisticated models are at for making a twin of a human? How many sort of different types of sensory information and depths of belief and time scales of sort of the light cone going forward are they accommodating at the moment, the most sophisticated models?
Well, they're normally as sophisticated as they need to be to give you precise estimates of the confidence that people ascribe to their prior beliefs. So when we talked before about sort of phenotyping people in terms of their prior beliefs, the most important prior beliefs are exactly this confidence or precision that we've just been talking about. And as you've rightly noted, this precision can be extremely context sensitive and contextualized by new information that the situation has changed, and therefore my prior beliefs, my preferences, and the precision, the strength of the commitment, the weight I give to that particular prior belief about my preferences, for example, will itself now change and be recontextualized. So this is the art of living and choosing in this context sensitive way that requires the sense making, the belief updating that we've been talking about. But if you want to drill down on these really important, and I should just say that the word precision is important here. So precision is usually the kind of variable or belief that has the greatest explanatory power in terms of determining what we do and what emphasis and what weight we afford to various things, and indeed what we attend to and what we ignore. So usually these models are aimed at trying to estimate the precision of some prior preferences or some other beliefs in the subject in question. So the way that aiming is usually done is to design a little experiment. So what we're talking about now, the kind of experiments you get in a psychology lab, you might find in an economics unit. So these game theoretic approaches that give you certain choices that are designed in order to elicit your preferences and the confidence that you place in these preferences. So the sophistication is not, the objective here is not to build agentic AI and humanoid robots with interoception and effective inference and theory of mind. The objective here is to define an experimental paradigm that best reveals what you want to know about this subject. Even though so within that remit, the models that have been used are actually quite sophisticated. In the sense that they do introduce this context sensitivity that you were talking about, and do interestingly pick up on your clever notion of the opposition of prior preferences, putting one thing in relation to another. There are lots of examples, and I repeat, if you go and look at the work of people like Ryan Smith, the Laureate Institute, you'll find lots of lovely experiments that have been replicated in quite large numbers of people with various disorders and in neurotypical subjects. But one of the first examples of this was a game in which you could choose to get a reward, but the longer you waited, the more reward you would get. But there was always a small possibility that the option will be taken off the table. So you've now got, shall I wait longer? Well, if I wait a little bit longer, I'm going to get a more reward, more money. But there's also, set in opposition to that, the increased danger that this reward is going to be taken away completely. So this requires quite a sophisticated generative model to work out, where am I? How long have I been waiting? What are the probability of this happening? What's the probability of that happening? Well, how likely am I to secure a reward? So that's, you can actually elaborate quite sophisticated games. At the moment, these games are usually just limited to sort of visual cues and auditory cues and very simple discrete choice behaviors. It will be really interesting in the future to start putting sort of interoception and heart rate and that kind of thing in the game. We certainly have models that are not used in this sort of computational phenotyping context that do now get upset and they have a racing heart when they see a spider, just based upon certain sort of properties of natural agents, where they have an internal model or generative model that renders their, say, visual perception dependent upon their bodily perception, say interoception. So a really simple example here would be at certain phases in my heartbeat, I will change the pressure of blood flow to my sensory epithelia in my eye, rendering me less visually precise or acute. Now, I know that because I have inherited and learned a generative model of the way that my body works, including the visual information gathering sensors that I have available. So that means now that there's a dependency between the moment-to-moment bodily state that I'm currently in and the way that I'm gathering visual data. And if you actually put these into these generative models, then what you get some really interesting interactions, in the sense that if my heart is racing, then I can interpret myself as either being compromised in terms of visual acuity, but also I'm likely to be in a flight and fright mode. So I must have seen something that frightened me, but I don't know what it is because I can't see it. Because you get these interesting sort of virtuous or vicious circles when you start to combine this information together.
So I've heard of those sorts of studies with, I think originally with Hugo Critchley and Sarah Garfinkel, where they looked at the heartbeat evoked potential and flashed images to people at different stages and looked at how well or how they process those images at different stages of the heart. But I've never heard it explained in that way, that if the heart's racing, then perhaps that will, I could develop an awareness that my visual perception might not be as I might not be able to pick out details as well as when my heart is calm. I've never heard it explained that way, so that's really interesting.
Yes, but it's probably not a wonderful explanation in the sense that because he raised an interesting point there. So Sarah and Hugo are true artists at being able to understand the sort of second by second cardiac phase locked implications for perception. But you also bring to the table sort of a more sort of James Langian perspective on this. That if I'm always making sense of evidence from the eyes and from the heart, and I feel that my heart is racing, then one simple hypothesis is that I must be anxious, for example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And if I am anxious, what other evidence do I have that I am anxious? And what am I anxious about? So you might actually start to attend to other cues, so, extraceptive cues. So the notion that I know that I can't see very well, so it just becomes part of this picture. But one interesting example here, which I think sort of does fit into that story, is the notion of saccadic suppression. So that this is a phenomena that when you move your eyes, you can't see the optic flow or the visual motion that's been induced by you moving your eyes. So for the for your audience, they can actually perform a little experiment on themselves, which Helmholtz originated. That if you look from side to side, then the world doesn't move. But if you move your eyes just by gently palpating and pushing the exterior corner of your eyes, you can actually make the world shift around. So this is a remarkable capacity of the brain to ignore a sign of very low precision to sensory visual input when it has been caused by eye movement, when you've caused it yourself, which suggests that if I'm going to be on a situation of high alert and that I am not going to, that I am in some kind of danger and I am in a flight or fright mode, then it's unlikely that I'm going to move my eyes a lot. So I'm going to freeze. So, part of freezing, obviously, I don't want to attract the attention of a predator, but also part of freezing does actually enable me to maximize the precision of information arriving visually. You get the same sort of phenomena with when people are trained to be snipers or fire a gun. They slow down, they stop breathing, and in some instances even will miss a cardiac beat prior to actually acting or
wow.
Firing their missile at their perceived target.
So we can train the nervous system can be trained over time to support the precision of a future action. I'm just going back to the concept of precision. If I recall correctly, your work with Mark Solms, which I sort of really enjoyed reading about through his book, The Hidden Spring, he worked with you to understand the free energy principle and active inference to sort of promote the idea that feelings or affect guide our consciousness. So when the precision is, when that affect, when we're consciously aware of a feeling, that means that whatever we're focused on has got this high precision. Is that so? Is precision, is that, have I understood that correctly? Precision can be equated to affect in that sense.
Yeah, well, certainly in the sense of Mark's work and the way that he conceptualizes experience or in terms of feelings. Absolutely, that is spot on. So he has this lovely phrase, felt uncertainty. I was on a podcast with him earlier on today, and he used palpating uncertainty. We have and I heard another lovely phrase from a colleague at King's, which was sort of the ability of the brain to take its own temperature. So precision is inverse temperature. These are statistical concepts. I kept referring previously to sort of probability distributions as Bayesian beliefs. And a very precise belief is one which is very, very sharp. A very imprecise one has a lot of latitude, and that basically can be read as a precise belief being very confident in your belief, and a very imprecise one you don't quite know, so you're lacking in confidence. Mathematically, you can call that inverse temperature. This is a sort of cold-headed, sort of cool-minded, very precise belief. But when the precision is very small, the temperature is very high, and you're very hot-headed, you don't quite, you're not quite sure where you are in this space. So this precision is a really important, and nearly every belief structure in the brain, which means that for nearly every substrate, neuroactivity or connectivity or whatever biophysical substrate you're talking about, is equipped with a precision. And Mark's argument is that feeling in and of itself just entails a belief updating of these precisions. And that's really, I think, an important observation that fits very much with the neuropsychology of conscious awareness. And by neuropsychology, I just mean what particular lesions of the brain would cause a profound change in your experience or your feelings or your conscious level. And the answer to that question from Mark's or from the perspective of the current conversation is that these areas comprise the cells of origin of particular neurotransmitter systems that control the gain and the precision of various representations, say in the cortex, but also in the subcortex. And I use the word gain there because one way of thinking about this psychologically is attentional gain. So as you afford more precision to certain, say, beliefs about the elemental visual causes of your visual input, you are effectively describing something. I am selectively attending to this. So there's a deep link between feeling as feeling uncertainty, feeling your inverse temperature, palpating your uncertainty, palpating your precision, and attention, and all the neuromodulating mechanisms that are the substrate dependent processes by which these beliefs about precision are updated. So I think that picking out Mark's formulation, I think, is absolutely the right thing to do, because that says there are lots of ways which we can have false inferences and false beliefs and delusions, hallucinations, and all sorts of ways in which dysmorphophobias that can be manifest. But usually at the end of the day, it all rests on a failure to encode uncertainty, or to take your own mental temperature, or to feel your own uncertainty and respond to it appropriately. And I could wax lyrical about sort of philosophers who also believe that to have quantum experience, you have to actually have some control over your processing of the information, in the sense of equipping it with a particular precision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's lots of directions I'd like to go to now. I'm going to have to let the precision or the affect arise to help me choose which one. What I did have a question about the concept of sacrifice, but I think we've kind of touched on that with the choice question about going down the street and long-term or collective sort of community-based decisions versus my own, what feels optimal for me right now. I can see how they're just a matter of holding a belief and weighting that against current, new sensory information. You mentioned a conversation before we went live. You said you were with Mike Levin earlier today, and that reminds me of something else I've been wondering about for quite some time. So I first heard about Mike Levin's work when he was thinking about the bioelectrical properties of living systems, and how we have separation of charge across membranes, and there may be fields associated with these and so on. Recently, Nick Lane and one of his colleagues has published a paper suggesting that mitochondrial membranes and the oscillating electromagnetic fields could provide a physical substrate for feeling. So what Mark Solms would call affect, or what we call precision. So if that's true, then mitochondria, or these kind of this field on a membrane, is where we're feeling the affect from. It's kind of the the emotional charge, you could say. How does that idea sit with you? And if what comes to mind with me is if there's a let's go back to the idea of a long-term prediction into the future. So I want to be acting right for my grandchildren, and I've got a feeling of love towards my future self in 10 years with a grandchild. If this proposal by Nick Lane is right, then my mitochondria must be doing something, must be altering their flux based on that prediction in order for me to feel the sensation now. Whereas that goes slightly against how I understand mitochondria to work, in terms of they're just kind of receiving glucose or acetyl-CoA and processing it as quickly as they can. They wouldn't be responding to a sudden change of thought, like a sudden idea of I've won the lottery, or I've my future in 10 years' time is at threat.
Right, that's a challenging question. Yeah, I think you can put them together, but you'd have to make a number of moves in order to connect the two scales or levels of description. First of all, the notion of planning deep into the future, and just incidentally, sacrifice and indeed self-sacrifice is indeed, as you intimated, just an expression of the prior belief that I am the kind of good citizen that would sacrifice myself in this context for my brothers in arms or for my children. So survival is, this is not about, the free energy principle in active inference is not about describing things that self-preserve themselves. It's about describing things that have certain beliefs about how they should behave. And if you're the kind of thing that should sacrifice yourself for your children or for your brothers in arms, then you will certainly do that. And that is its behaving in a characteristic way. But to come back to the mitochondrial issue, I think that what we're talking about now is the separation of scales, noting that the free energy principle and active inference in some elemental form must apply at all scales. So you could I could take Nick's arguments as basically equipping, in the spirit of Mike Levin, mitochondria with a narrative and with their own sense-making abilities, and say that simply in virtue of the fact that the mitochondria has a Markov blanket, it has a way of separating itself from the rest of the cell, then it is a thing, and therefore one can interpret what's going on inside the mitochondria as modeling an internal model, as making predictions about, possibly even planning, their course of action in relation to the rest of the cell that is not the mitochondria. I don't think that's what you were talking about. That's a really plausible and important sort of story to tell. And I would imagine if Mike was here, that's the kind of story he'd be looking for. He'd be sort of trying to go away from the neurochauvinism about sense-making, decision-making, and say it's everywhere. Just to exist is to be cognitive. In the sense, in the mathematical sense of, afforded by the free energy principle, that just existing in some characteristic states licenses you to say that there's some kind of inference and learning going on underneath the hood. And you see that, at every scale, and Mike certainly sees it at a sort of mesoscopic and biological and cellular and cellular scale. Nick's probably sees it at an intra or subcellular scale. If you want to link that to the scale of me, not as a cell or a mitochondria or organelle, but as an embodied collection of organs that has that is much, much bigger at a much higher scale. I think it's easy to do in the sense that our internal model, which stands in for things that are out there, um, means that there are going to be particular cellular or neuronal populations that stand in for me being a good grandparent, or the attributes or the consequences of what defines being a good grandparent. So every dimension of being a good grandparent must at some point have some representation in neuropopulation in the brain. And that means if I want to score or evaluate my behavior, I'm going to have to activate these neural populations in order to evaluate the expected surprise I would get if I did that. In so doing, they will be activated. And furthermore, if they are held with undue precision, the neuromodulatory gain on the presynaptic inputs to these cells will also be very, very high. And that means that they are going to respond by encoding a profound belief update. Now, there are certain physical laws, which means that any change in the information represented by this cell has to be paid in terms of a metabolic or thermodynamic cost, things like the Gininsky quality and Landauer's principle, which means that the mitochondria will certainly have to produce more energy. So you will recognize the context has changed out there. So from the point of view of the mitochondria, the context is suddenly I've got lots of presynaptic inputs to the cellular membrane, and furthermore, the postsynaptic sensitivity has been augmented by these neuromodulatory Mark Solms ascending neurotransmitter systems. What's my response to that? Well, I'm the kind of thing that generates energy in this context. So I'm going to respond. So you've got this sort of nested inference at this very cellular scale that is entirely consistent with the, in this particular instance, a sort of personal narrative inference about the grandfather walking down the street. So you've got this notion of an internally consistent physics of belief updating, physics of sentience, physics or the calculus of sentient behavior playing out at multiple nested scales, all internally consistent, where the higher scale provides a context in the low level. So from that point of view, Nick would be perfectly licensed to say that at some point in this cell, in this neuropopulation, in this brain, in this person, there is a response to a particular context that generates the feeling in the Mark Solms sense that there is now an enactment of a very precise change in the precision of the personal beliefs at the level of the entire brain or the entire person. So that's how I would try to sort of contextualize this sort of mitochondria-centric application within the kind of application that we might use as therapists or psychologists.
Fascinating. I'm just checking the time. Are you okay for a few more minutes?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So I'd like to think a little bit about how we observe changes in brain activity in people. So they might put them in an fMRI machine and look at bold signals, which are changes in blood flow in the brain, and then I guess you can see these different depths of structure and architecture in the brain lighting up, and that might give you clues about what layer of belief or message passing is happening through the brain. Has there been any experiments done looking at, I know people, there's lots of work being done where you show people visual images, but are there any where people somehow report either by pressing a button or when they feel a change in affect, and then looking at how that the order, sort of the causal direction of when the person records the change in affect and how quickly something lights up in the brain? Because I'm just thinking about this sort of mitochondria or microtubules or whatever is being proposed as the substrate for the experience of the affect. Which
Yeah.
comes first?
I think it's easier to answer that last question than it is the first question. The answer to which comes first is both. This is circular causality. This is there is no it's both bottom up and top down causation. So the bottom up causation that would be the Nick Lane perspective. That the feeling is engendered by the particular activation or response of these mitochondria in this part of the brain, in this cellular population. And that is now causing a response. This cell is now going to actually generate spikes or action potentials and going to have an influence on parts of the brain that are connected via axonal processes elsewhere. The top-down causation is what we've been talking about. The brain, the person has been planning, and that has now sent a particular set of activating presynaptic inputs that have been greased by these neuromodulator neurotransmitter systems that actually enable or realize the presynaptic inputs to provide the context to enable the mitochondria to respond. That was a long-winded way of just re-emphasizing there is no chicken or egg. It is just a dynamic in a loosely coupled dynamical system that evinces the circular causality that you always get in these deeply structured scale-free or scale-invariant contexts. The other part of your question, it is actually easy to answer, and I think it's a great question. Quite literally, the thermodynamic cost of belief updating that inherits from those physical principles I just mentioned, Landau's principle and things like the Janinski equality, mean that for every belief update, namely every activation of some brain cells, there is a corresponding thermodynamic cost that is measured in terms of joules per bit. This is exactly what we measure with things like fMRI and EEG. And indeed, you can just plot the amplitude of an event response using electrophysiology or the amplitude of a hemodynamic response looking at the metabolic or in particular the hemodynamic correlates of this belief updating cost. And they have an almost linear relationship with the amount of belief updating as measured in terms of natural units or bits of information as we change our mind in response to information from the sensorium or lower parts in the brain's hierarchy. So I think it's really important that you ask that question, because now, after 30 years of brain mapping, when I look at an activation, a map of brain activations, all I see is, that's where the belief updating was, and it must have been equipped with precision in order to be realized. And you and I know it was caused by mitochondria, or was it? Or was it actually caused by some emotional set or intentional set or some affect? And then the middle part of your question was, are there any experiments that look particularly at the neuronal correlates of this sort that speak to the functional anatomy and the computational architecture, usually, as you note, of a hierarchical sort, that would speak to the deployment of precision or attention in the spirit of Mark Solms's commitment that to change your precision is to feel, or feelings are evinced purely because you've equipped them with a particular confidence or precision. And the answer is yes. So, every experiment you could possibly imagine has now been done in an fMRI setup or with EEG over the past decades or so. All the low-hanging fruit were done in the first 5 years, and then everything else after that. So there are numerous experiments looking at, say, attentional the mechanism of attention, either in the visual or the auditory domain. I think probably more interesting for you are those that focus on the integration of interoception and exteroception that would have these sort of emotional aspects that are more deeply implicated in the parts of your internal models or generative models that would entail this minimal selfhood, or models of myself, or how I am currently processing hierarchically, doing the message passing that you mentioned. And they highlight areas of the brain, which I'm sure you know more about than I do, things like the anterior insula, the posterior insula, and right up to the anterior cingulate, all getting information from the visceral forebrain and all of those, and many other parts of the brain when we talk about the insula. So there's a convergence of multiple modalities that have meaning for where I should attend next. And in particular, if you look at attention as a kind of mental action, deploying precision in the right kind of way, given this context, then not only where should I look next, but where should I, not where should I attend next, but more generally, how should I act next? I think there's a deep connection between affect, recognizing you're in a particular affective state, the precision, and being an agent that can actually act upon things, not just in terms of autonomic reflexes and moving your eyes or moving your arms, but also acting on the inside to actually deploy your precision, to grease those pathways, to enable that presynaptic input, to enable the mitochondria to respond, to produce the energy required for the belief updating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I guess is the sort of the rationale for allostasis, sort of to budget your body, your overall, wherever we're going to draw the boundary of the system that we're trying to organize and manage. How am I going to budget all the different resources into the future, and act and alter my current state to help me as I move forward? Well, thank you so much. You've been super generous, and whenever I listen to your interviews, I'm sort of admire the way that you are patient with the person asking the questions and provide such elaborate answers. So I'd like to, in being aware of the time, like to just offer you the chance to help people find out more about your work. Where's the best place to discover your work, and maybe just an insight into what's exciting you with your work over the next weeks or months?
Right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure. You asked some brilliant questions, and I'm sure I over-answered them as I promised I would. So I apologize for my elaborations. You can find out about our work in many places. It's usually the academic literature, but the Active Inference Institute is a really good resource there. I know that's how you discovered Active Inference, so I would certainly recommend that. And there are lots of like-minded people and potential correspondents and possibly even mentors that can be accessed through the Active Inference Institute. What am I doing at the moment? I basically do what I'm told. At the moment, I'm working on an extension to this expected information gain, or this sort of information seeking part of the expected surprise or free energy, and extending it to model structures in the spirit of probabilistic inductive logic programming, or radical constructivism, depending upon your field. Reasoning. I'm working on reasoning of the kind that you and I do when doing experiments, and designing the right kind of experiment that's going to disambiguate between my hypotheses.
Reasoning. Well, we could have a whole session talking about reasoning and discernment. Well, thank you very much, Karl, and I hope to speak to you again sometime in the future.
Lovely. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay.